At the moment, approximately 780,000 Syrian refugees are registered with UNHCR as refugees. And that number is, I think, very frequently in the public domain. UNHCR is again a custodian. We manage an international system that is derived from international law. So we continue to indeed have a number of refugees registered with us until 2015. And people who, after the date, approached us have been recorded as people with protection concerns. I don't think there's an international conspiracy. And if there is one, we're definitely not part of it. We are simply here as UNHCR, as a mandated organization, to help Lebanon in what is admittedly a very, very difficult situation, the hosting of refugees. And we have said consistently as UNHCR that we are not promoting integration or naturalization of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Camps is generally not something that as UNHCR we promote. It costs a lot of money. Camps close to borders often generate a lot of other questions. Again, there is already very much reduced amount of money available for our work, and donors would rather spend it on something that is better possible and maybe with more impact now, as opposed to spending a lot of money on a camp on the border that may be dissolved in a few years from now.
أهلا بكم مشاهدينا حلقة جديدة من أساس الحكي، وضيفي في هذه الحلقة رئيس مكتب المفوضية السامية للأمم المتحدة لشؤون اللاجئين في لبنان ايفو فرانجن. أهلا بك سيد فرانجن. سأبدأ معك. طبعا المفوضية تشغل يعني الساحة اللبنانية في هذه الأيام. ما هو دور المفوضية حاليا في ملف النازحين السوريين؟
Thank you for having me and for this very important opening question. The role of UNHCR, the refugee agency, is essentially, in a nutshell, to support Lebanon, the Lebanese institutions, the Lebanese government, and Lebanon at large in the hosting of what is indeed a large number of refugees. This is a very big responsibility that Lebanon has with the international community. So we help Lebanon in ensuring that people who need to continue to benefit from protection because they cannot go back to Syria and are in need of other forms of assistance, material or financial assistance, get support. And we have been doing this for more than a decade, obviously. And as part of these efforts, we also have a very strong focus with other organizations on support to vulnerable Lebanese and also support to Lebanese institutions so that they can continue to do their work that is part of the hosting of refugees. And then, of course, since a few months, we are very busy in the context of South Lebanon due to the conflict there.
اسمح لي أن أسأل، يعني انطلاقا من دور المفوضية، هناك انتقاد كبير لدى أكثر من قوى سياسية وقيادات لبنانية لدور المفوضية، بدءا من تمنعها أو تأخيرها في إعطاء داتا النازحين للسلطات اللبنانية، وأيضا فيما يتعلق بتمويل اللاجئين داخل لبنان، ما يدفعهم إلى البقاء في لبنان. بداية، هل سلمتم داتا التي لديكم إلى السلطات اللبنانية؟
Yeah, last year we had indeed a process together with the authorities to discuss data sharing, data transfer. An agreement was reached, and on the basis of that agreement in the autumn of last year, data was indeed shared with the authorities. And we have very recently received an additional request for data. And then that goes essentially through the same process. This was shared with our headquarters. And then, of course, UNHCR stands very prepared to respond to this in a timely manner. Perhaps discussions will be needed. And these are to take place in the near term.
متى?
In the very near term, that I think we're talking days and weeks. I had a meeting on this yesterday also with the authorities. So that process is now ongoing.
ولكن كمان يعني يقال بأنه الداتا اللي سلمتوها للسلطات اللبنانية لا تتضمن الأماكن التي نزحوا منها، وبالتالي هي ناقصة نوعا ما.
Let me just again repeat that last year we had a long discussion, and then there was an agreement on the type of data that would be shared, and precisely that set was shared, and I think that was to the full agreement and satisfaction of all parties concerned. Now we have an additional request, which we can understand, and then we will again discuss.
What is about the request? ما هو الطلب اللي قدم لكم من السلطات الجديد؟
The new request relates to the date when people came or were registered. We understand there's also a request for telephone numbers and for places of origin. And then I have an obligation to be guided by international rules and regulations when it comes to data sharing by virtue of our mandate. So this is with our headquarters, and we will imminently respond to this, because of course we are always interested to have a constructive dialogue.
هل سيكون الجواب إيجابي؟ يعني the answer will be positive?
That I'm not in a position to now say what the outcome of that is. That is with my headquarters. Yeah.
ما هو الرقم المسجل لديكم لعدد النازحين السوريين؟ لأن هناك تناقض بالأرقام. المفوضية في بيروت، كم هو عدد النازحين لديها المسجل؟
At the moment, approximately 780,000 Syrian refugees are registered with UNHCR as refugees. And that number is, I think, very frequently in the public domain.
And this is for the period of...
Registration came to an end, was stopped in 2015, as per a directive from the authorities.
Okay. Yeah. رئيس حزب القوات اللبنانية دكتور سمير جعجع اعتبر أن المفوضية تمنح صفة لاجئ لشخص ليس لاجئا. هل فعلا هذا ما يحصل؟
UNHCR is again a custodian. We manage an international system that is derived from international law in general, and refugee law, as all member states do. And on the basis of that, there is an understanding that people who have been fleeing and continue to flee Syria due to protection-related reasons or conflict-related reasons are considered refugees. Or should at least have an opportunity to make themselves known and approach our office. So we continue to indeed have a number of refugees registered with us until 2015, and people who after the date approached us have been recorded as people with protection concerns. And the same applies to other countries, to member states across the globe.
هل تدرك بأنه 45% من السوريين اليوم في لبنان غير مسجلين؟ وكيف يمكن معالجة هذه المسألة؟
We have been approached by Syrians who are either registered as refugees or recorded. There are perhaps other Syrians in this country as well. If they don't come to UNHCR, and we sometimes hear fairly large numbers, this is then primarily a question that is, I think, of concern to the authorities. So not all Syrians are known to UNHCR, not all Syrians are refugees, but those who approach us with protection concerns are in line with international law and the viewpoints of the international community considered refugees.
أيضا فيما يتعلق ب يعني نسبة الذين يتلقون المساعدات، يحكى أنه نسبة كبيرة ممن يستفيدون من المساعدات بصفة لاجئين ليسوا لاجئين، يدخلون ويخرجون إلى سوريا.
On the issue of pendular movements, as we call them, or commuters, a few things that are important to point out. This is, in our assessment, much smaller when it comes to refugees than what is commonly understood. The vast majority of people who need protection and we consider refugees are in Lebanon and don't move. It's too difficult, too expensive, too dangerous. And we see it whenever we send messages to refugees because there's something that we need to discuss with them. They are in front of our office within a matter of hours or a day. There are for sure other groups that commute. They're not necessarily known to us. They may be migrant workers that commute across the border. And that is again something that you would have to discuss with the authorities. And then there could be cases where a refugee indeed has to go to to Aleppo to attend to a funeral, a family situation, and comes back. We think these are incidents, a very small number of cases, that cannot be extrapolated to the whole population. And does not mean in international law terms that you're no longer a refugee. But we understand that this is not easy to understand for the broader public, but we mainly appeal to ensure that we do not base ourselves on broad assumptions. This is, in our view, a very, very small dynamic that actually relates to the refugee community.
المواقف في لبنان تدعو المفوضية إلى تقديم المساعدات للاجئين السوريين داخل سوريا، وهذا سيساعد في أن يبقوا في أراضيهم. لماذا لا تفعل ذلك المفوضية؟
That's again a very important and relevant question, where I always first stress there is assistance already being provided in Syria. And that should be our message to the international community. Make sure that the United Nations and other organizations continue to have enough money to do useful work in Syria. And we see funding levels going down in Syria, which is not a good development. So there is already assistance in Syria. Reductions of assistance in Lebanon, stopping it here and giving it to the other side, or providing it on the other side of the border, is not such an easy solution and perhaps not a good idea, because it may not work. We see our assistance here already getting less, and we have not seen more return. There are lots of reasons why people still don't want to go back, and simply stopping assistance is not going to help. And some member states that give us the money for assistance here in Lebanon do not necessarily agree to give it on the other side of the border. And on the other side of the border, we again mainly appeal to the Syrian authorities to make sure that they take steps so that refugees have more confidence. Refugees need confidence so that they can go back safely, in dignity, voluntarily. It's not just a material and assistance question that is going to lead to increased return. So it's a complicated situation.
ما هو حجم المساعدات التي تقدمونها حاليا؟ وهل صحيح أن نسبة المساعدات ستتراجع نتيجة انخفاض مساهمة المانحين؟
We are very worried. UNHCR is worried about our funding situation, and we see this similarly worrisome trend among other agencies. A few years ago, I received approximately, or my organization here received approximately 350 million to spend on assistance to refugees and Lebanese institutions in Lebanon. And I think that in a year or two that will be half. So we are going below 200 million, and we may be going to 180
after 1
million.
year.
Well, it is, again, that depends on funding trends, but it's getting less. And our message to the international community is, let us please stay the course. Lebanon continues to need assistance. We need solutions, durable solutions like return. In the meantime, our appeal to the international community is to stay the course and not reduce funding levels in Lebanon. It's difficult because the needs are still there, and we understand also the anxiety and pressure in Lebanon. So that again is very important to have the figures right, because they're often not well understood. Of course, a lot of things have been done in recent years as well to provide more financial assistance to vulnerable Lebanese families, because again, people are vulnerable, they're vulnerable and need assistance. And it helps us that both communities receive the assistance that they need. But generally, amounts are getting less, and the number of refugees receiving financial assistance is getting less. And in any event, it is always a small fraction of what they need. We all know how high the prices have gone in Lebanon. Transportation, school, medical.
What do you talk about less? How much less do you mean?
Well, that again, these amounts in the past, it was refugee families got much more than the amount that we're currently giving. So these amounts are reducing, and that may happen again in the future if we get less funding from donors.
لبنان بلد عبور وليس بلد لجوء، والاتفاقية التي عقدت بين الدولة اللبنانية والمفوضية عام 2003 تنظم علاقة لبنان بالنزوح السوري، وتنص على استقبالهم لمدة سنة فقط على أن يتم توطينهم في دولة ثانية. مرة 13 عاما على استقبال لبنان النازحين السوريين، فماذا فعلت المفوضية في هذا الخصوص؟ وهل فعلا رحلتم لاجئين إلى دولة ثانية؟ وما هو العدد؟
I think I would like to first address a persistent misunderstanding on the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding of 2003.
Okay.
That was a memorandum which was drawn up many years before the Syrian refugee crisis. It was meant primarily for a small number of primarily Iraqi refugees. It quickly became irrelevant and was definitely not applicable to this very
Syrians.
large situation that started to unfold in 2011 when a lot of Syrians came to Lebanon. So that is a misunderstanding that we really need to address. And we actually recognized that with the government, many years ago, we were rediscussing another MOU that never came about. But the 2003...
Why?
That is before my time. I think it was just a mutual understanding that it was maybe not yet the right time. But the 2003 memo of a memorandum of understanding is not applicable. On resettlement, our message is that we would like, indeed, the international community to continue to provide opportunities for Syrians hosted generously by Lebanon to go to another country. That's not something I can decide. I require then decisions by generous and hospitable governments elsewhere to say we can receive next year 2,000 Syrians or 1,000 Syrians. So we are always advocating towards the international community for what we call burden sharing, including through resettlement.
You're trying with some countries?
That is, I think, 50% of my time is consumed.
Have you succeeded until now?
It's not increasing, no. So it's not increasing a lot, but globally it's not enough. But we will always, in support of Lebanon, continue to make the appeal towards the international community.
So why Lebanon is going to just take this burden alone?
That is our message, and you hear this from UNHCR across the board, that we cannot expect refugee hosting countries adjacent to the countries from where people fled from to do all the heavy lifting for many, many years. We need financial support for these countries. We need resettlement so that other countries also shoulder the burden. And we need much more international action on solutions, because this is indeed not a situation where we can be complacent and where Lebanon can be expected to stay the course without any form of challenge and complication.
في هذه المرحلة بات ينظر إلى أزمة النازحين وبأنها باتت تشكل خطر على وجود لبنان. هناك خوف حتى من توطين النازحين في لبنان. هل فعلا هناك نية لدى المجتمع الدولي إلى توطين النازحين وتغيير يعني شكل لبنان في المرحلة المقبلة؟
I don't think there's an international conspiracy, and if there is one, we're definitely not part of it. We are an independent humanitarian organization that does not allow itself to be part of a conspiracy like this. We are simply here as UNHCR, as a mandated organization, to help Lebanon in what is admittedly a very, very difficult situation, the hosting of refugees, making sure that people who fled, who cannot go back, continue to be supported, and to help Lebanon also through advocacy, again, on this priority to have better conditions in Syria so that people can go back. And we have said consistently as UNHCR that we are not promoting integration or naturalization of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. You can very easily find these statements. But for as long as people are here and have no choice but to stay here, our aim is to ensure that as much as possible support is provided to them and their host communities. That is our task in support of Lebanon.
حصل منذ فترة يعني تحدثت معلومات عن قيامكم ببناء خيم على ضفاف الليطاني في أماكن عامة يعني تابعة لمؤسسة الليطاني، وأيضا يعني نقلتوا النازحين من منطقة إلى منطقة.
Yeah.
ما حقيقة هذه المعلومات؟ وهل يمكن للمفوضية أن تبني خيام يعني على أماكن عامة تابعة للدولة من دون إبلاغ الدولة اللبنانية بذلك؟
So after 1 year in this country, allow me to be a bit more confrontational here with some journalists.
Yes, please.
Let them first of all approach us and ask what is true before putting something like this in the public domain. Because this is another example of a very unfortunate, totally untrue story, frankly.
But we've seen footage. We've
But
seen footage.
Now, what I mean is that UNHCR is not deciding where refugees can go, can settle in this country. That's not our prerogative. We don't have that role. It's the role of the state that we fully respect to indicate how and where refugees can be accommodated. So in this particular case, there was no plan or scheme orchestrated by UNHCR to bring a certain group of refugees from one part of the country to another. That is totally beyond our level of authority and competence in this country.
What happened?
I don't know what happened. I only know that what we were being accused of or what was in the public domain is not something that we were involved in at all. We don't move groups of refugees without authorization, or it is not part of a plan that involves the refugees and the competent authorities. So I'm not in a position to respond to this.
البعض في لبنان يعتبر أن نظام الأسد يعرقل العودة. فما رأيك بهذا الكلام؟ وما هي مسؤولية فعلا السلطات السورية في هذا الخصوص؟
As I said in response to earlier questions, the solution is in Syria. We talk to refugees consistently, do surveys, and they always indicate the reasons why it is difficult for them to go back, or even impossible to consider going back. We, at our level as UNHCR, raise these issues with the Syrian authorities from the level of the president and ministries. And our main message is that if the Syrians and the international community want more people to go back, then the conditions for return need to be further created.
Ready.
And that is a responsibility that the Syrian authorities have, and we try to do our level best to be constructively engaged. But it would require much more than only UNHCR. This is clearly something that is also beyond a UN agency. So we expect member states to rally around this issue and find a way of have a constructive dialogue on this in a highly politicized context. Let us also be clear, this is not easy. But our message is we cannot also continue like this, so let's collectively see what can be done to create better conditions for return in Syria.
هناك حل عاد الكلام عنه بالفترة الأخيرة بإنشاء مخيمات على الحدود. هل فعلا يمكن أن يتحقق ذلك؟
Camps is generally not something that as UNHCR we promote. It costs a lot of money. Camps close to borders often generate a lot of other questions.
It happened in Turkey, it happened in Jordan.
It's true, but that was like 10 years ago. My assessment of this is that we're much better off to find pragmatic, much less costly solutions, which is making sure that people are supported in the places where they currently reside. The majority are in urban settings and in small settlements. Make sure that these are as efficiently as possible managed, and that we continue to focus on durable solutions, as opposed to now asking for an enormous amount of money to establish camps at the border, because the refugees would still be in Lebanon. The money would most likely not be provided. So I always struggle a little bit to understand what the purpose would be of such a scheme. And I don't think we would get the money, quite frankly, from the donor community for such a difficult exercise. Yeah.
Why?
Because again, there is already very much reduced amount of money available for our work, and donors would rather spend it on something that is better possible and maybe with more impact now, as opposed to spending a lot of money on a camp on the border that may be dissolved in a few years from now.
في أيار المقبل هناك مؤتمر في بروكسل للنازحين السوريين. يحكى بأنه صار في أجواء إيجابية من المجتمع الدولي، من الاتحاد الأوروبي، بحثا عن حل لهذه المسألة. ماذا يجب أن نتوقع؟
Difficult for me to speak on behalf of all participants in Brussels. It's a large event, but one can assume that the UNHCR message will be primarily twofold. That 13, 14 years into this crisis, we cannot be complacent and just carry on and hope for the best. So there will be a message to the international community to explore what is possible in terms of engagement in and on Syria. Again, we admit that it is difficult and sensitive and so on and so forth, that is perhaps going to take some time. But if we want people to go back, then we need to look at return conditions in Syria. In the meantime, we will be calling for sustained or increased support to the main refugee hosting countries surrounding Syria, for refugees, for vulnerable host communities, and the institutions that do so much in their efforts to stay the course. So that is the twofold message that most likely UNHCR will bring to the table, and which we hope will be resonating in other quarters as well.
Our Prime Minister seems optimistic those days, and he's talking about a solution, a new solution for the refugees.
Well, I agree with the Prime Minister that what is positive is that everybody understands that we cannot put our head in the sand, that we have a heightened obligation in a situation like Lebanon, 13 years, funding is going down, lots of other global priorities, to think this through. So that we very much welcome. Then the only thing we, as UNHCR, will call for is a factual, analytical, and strategic approach, realistic as well, where we as humanitarians can do a number of things, and where the big solutions, quite frankly, especially when it comes to Syria and the wider region, need to come from the security, political, and economic domain. So there we have more an advocacy role as opposed to being able to do that ourselves.
سيد ايفو فرايجسن، شكرا جزيلا على هذا اللقاء، وشكرا للمشاهدين أيضا، وإلى اللقاء في حلقة جديدة من أساس الحكي.